Hello, and welcome to my Precision Teaching Podcast. My name is Rick Cabina, and tonight I'm joined by my co-host, Doug Kostowitz.
Hello, everybody.
And this is 2 months in a row. This is a great piece of behavioral momentum we got going here, Doug.
I hope that we can just keep it going. I hadn't listened or remember, but we had that great line last month, and it's flown away. So we're just gonna keep on trucking.
We'll just keep making up new lines as we go each month, and whatever one sticks, that's the one we use.
There you go.
I will say that we actually had our first email ever.
Wow.
Yeah, someone emailed back and said, "Nice job with the podcast." So I thank you, emailer out there. That was very kind of you to send an email. And as usual, Doug and I both encourage you all to give us feedback, ask us questions. If there are guests that you'd like to have in the future, please share your recommendations. If there are some articles you'd like for us to cover, please do so. And anything else that might be good for our Precision Teaching Podcast, please share that with us. You can email Doug or myself.
That would be really neat to address the concerns out there and know that we're doing something that people want to listen to. So that's exciting.
Yeah, we have a small but growing audience, which is nice. And I hope that as we increase our audience, people will start asking questions, because it'd be nice each month, or eventually if we can get to two a week. Yeah, that would really be something, wouldn't it?
That would be very exciting.
two a month. It would be nice to have a section where we have a question and answer session, or an email section, but we'll see how that goes. Well, we have a number of things to cover. We always like to start off the podcast with announcements, and we have two announcements tonight. The first announcement is that the International Precision Teaching Conference that we announced last month, that will be held in at University Park, we have the room rates that are available, and that information should be posted on acceleration.org very soon. And if people would like to reserve their room, they can. And the rooms, there's a code, and all they have to do is call the number that's on the website, and they'd be able to get a room. The other announcement we have is one that we'll probably talk about more next month, because our podcast guest next month is going to be a person who's very excited about this announcement. But the announcement is that the Chicago School recently has a very nice opportunity for people who are interested in working in Chicago, interested in maybe doing some furthering their education at the Chicago School. And the announcement that was posted to the listserv is really nice, because it shows there are 3 schools in Chicago that will be applying precision teaching, behavioral education, and they're going to have just a wonderful opportunity for people who would like to learn this technology and use this technology and see what effects it can have. And I'm really excited from the standpoint of, hey, you got 3 schools here, and with Chuck and Joe Lang, I believe, is going to be affiliated with this, and the other faculty at Chicago School. And I'm not sure all the people, I'm sure we'll hear more about that next month, but it sounds like a really cool opportunity.
It does. It's just exciting to get more people involved, more people to generate that excitement, and yes, very exciting.
The nicest thing about what we do is we generate data, lots of data. Mm-hmm. And we live in a climate where people are saying, hey, show us that you can produce a particular outcome. We can do that. And now that we have three schools, I'm hoping, again, I don't know how this will play out, but I'm hoping that they'll have that pre-post-test data. Also included, they're going to have tons of charts and other types of data out there, but having that shown very convincingly will be, I think it'll be remarkable for our field, and of course it will be really good for all the students who are receiving this instruction and everyone who's involved. So that's a good announcement, and we'll have more on that next month. We do have a guest today. Our later interview is Richard McManus, and Richard, we have a really good interview. We talk about the Fluency Factory. We talk about other precision teaching information. But before we get to that, we have an article to review. And the article that we are reviewing this month is, I don't know, I might say this one is something that might have flown under the radar presently because this is an older article, and I'm not sure how many people know about it. It came out in '83, and this article is called Variability, an Aid in the Assessment of the Effectiveness of Training Procedures. So this will be on the website if you'd like to download it, and it's written by Fred Spooner, Doreen Spooner, and it's really just an excellent article. What were your just general thoughts about this article before we get into talking about the specifics?
Well, it just the whole topic of variability, it brings something out that where usually you're thinking about as you're comparing treatment and intervention and baseline, you're thinking about a level change, you're thinking about acceleration change. It's the one that for the variability change is the one that we may not always focus on in determining the effectiveness of treatment. So that really brought some more things to light for me that maybe I haven't been as focused on as I should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, why don't we start talking about it? Let's get into, number one, what is variability? If someone asks you to define variability, that's something that I'm not sure is, people talk about it and people understand it, I think, but I'm not sure how much people really appreciate it. When we talk about variability, there are, well, just saying it very simply, what variability means is how much your behavior is varying from one instance to the next.
Okay.
And Johnson and Pennypacker, they have a nice, they use the term behavioral variability, and when they talk about behavioral variability, they have a nice definition, and their definition is variations in features of responding within a single response class.
Okay.
And what that means is, let's think about, think about something that we do. What would be an example of something we do? Well, maybe if we greet people, we are not every day going to greet people the same exact way. We have a response class there, but there's going to be variations in that behavior.
Right.
That's what we mean by behavioral variability. If you think about the an experimental chamber, and let's say we have a rat in there, and there is a lever, and even the rat, there could be variability with how the rat presses. The rat might not always be applying the same pressure. There's going to be variations in that responding. And when we talk about variability in data, we will, let's say we have a baseline. You have a baseline of data, you're not doing anything, and that behavior is going to vary. And of course, the term that we use in precision teaching is bounce. So we say that the behavior is bouncing around. So bounce and variability, we're talking about the same thing here. But in the baseline phase, there, whatever the behavior of interest is, we're going to see some bounce to it. It will be varying.
bounce around the where the acceleration's going.
Yes.
So it's the bounce. So it can bounce. If it's all lining up, then there's no bounce. But if you make your acceleration line and there's dots above and below, far, near, there's the bounce around that acceleration. So
I don't think we would ever see a graph that in baseline all the data points were the same.
Nope.
Unless we had some type of android or some future robot man or woman from the future.
I guess the only example I could think of is a behavior that the individual did not know how to do at all, and then you taught him.
Okay, I see what you're saying. If the behavior, if you measure it, it's 0 every single time.
Yeah, that would be the only thing. But
Yeah.
even then, it's not really even it's on the chart, but it's below that counting time. So it's that could be the only instance I could think of where there'd be no bounce. You just don't know how to do the behavior. You can't do the behavior.
Well, even if let's take something. Let's say we're interested in some type of algebra. Let's say we have factoring. They're factoring something, some type of expression. Even if someone tries that, the errors may vary from day to the next, even though the person's not getting anything right. When you think about variability, there is natural variability in behavior. It's part of being a biological being that we don't do things the same all the time. There's variability. And there's all types of factors that influence variability. And the key here is, if you think about from a research standpoint, when we have variability in our data, what we're looking at are, okay, why is this variability occurring? So yes, there's going to be some natural variability, but certain things can affect the variability in our behavior. And as you were pointing out, which is correct, there are certain things we're going to look for when we do an intervention. Obviously, we can look at the change in level. Does it change in level? We can look at the trend. So if we had a behavior that was going down and all of a sudden it's going up, we have that. But variability, this is something that is very important for us to look at. Variability could be, well, with precision teaching, what's neat about this, and we'll talk about this soon, is you can actually measure variability. You could put a number on it. Now, how important is that?
That's very important. I actually wanted to explain something, and I think that one aspect of variability we're very good at, I know you mentioned determining what's going on. And when we see some measure that's so it's an outlier, we're good at figuring out why we think it went so far off. But I think that maybe where I mentioned I'm not as it hasn't popped in. It's when it's closer or around that acceleration I look at. But those outliers, I think we're all pretty good at figuring out why did it go so high today, or why was it so low today. So I just wanted to add that before we go on. Sorry to.
No, that's a good point. I was reading an article by Skinner this past week, and one thing that was interesting that Skinner said, and I never really thought about this when you think about outliers, but Skinner said there really is no such thing as outliers. And what he meant by that is there are reasons why every behavior occurs.
Right.
And if you have an outlier, what are the conditions that are producing this extraordinary behavior? And of course, when we think about outlier, we can visualize that. We have this behavior that is moving along at some rate, it's bouncing around, but all of a sudden you have this exceptionally high or exceptionally low behavior, and it's way away from the mean of what you have or your typical behaviors. And why did that happen?
And our explanations usually revolve around, well, the student or person was very ill that day, or
if it's low, right?
Exceptionally wonderful thing happened right before they walked in. And listening to what you said about Skinner, that there is no outlier, and that's something just by you saying that made me think. My goodness, that makes total sense.
Yeah. Well,
The contingencies were arranged, and you got that behavior. So that's fantastic.
the other thing, too, along with that, I suppose, and this is something that, well, yeah, I'll just say this real quickly. It's interesting, too, even if you buy into that, then even if you think about errors, that's something, too, when you think about responding, behaviorally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is making an error, really what you're saying is this person hasn't come under stimulus control.
Mm-hmm.
But, we're not going to, I didn't mean to bring us into that conversation. But let's get back to talking about variability. So, we have an experiment, let's say, and we have our baseline, and there we have the behavior, it's bouncing around, and then we do something. And as you pointed out, and as we just said, we're going to look for different characteristics of this person's responding to see, is what we did having an effect? That's
Right.
basic science, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
You have this behavior that, again, it doesn't mean baseline doesn't mean you're not doing anything. It just means, it doesn't mean the absence of behavior. It just means you're not arranging any particular type of environmental or whatever you're doing, intervention.
It's the normal environment.
Yeah, it's a normal environment. So if you're teaching, you're just going along as normal and doing whatever you're doing. Intervention comes, now you got something special. And when you do that something special, you're looking for what response does occur in a person's behavior. And of course, the way we look at that is we measure behavior, and then we put it on our chart, and then we look at it. Now, when we look at that variability, if it's extremely variable, actually the variability is going to tell us one of three things. If it's highly variable, then that's telling us we don't have control.
Right.
We don't have experimental control. If it's moderately variable, then we could say, okay, we do have some control here. And if it's not variable, then we can say, or I should say not, I don't mean an absence of variability, a lower level variability, then we can start saying, okay, we're exerting some control over this behavior. And I don't mean necessarily us personally, but whatever we're doing
Right.
in that setting. And that variability is something that we should all have with our analyses. And the other thing that when I think about, I guess this is, again, me getting off a little bit, but I want to say this. When you think about what we can do with variability, that we can actually measure it and we can put numbers on it, why isn't everybody using the standard acceleration chart? I mean, honestly, here you have this important component of behavior, and you can put a number on it. Why isn't everyone using the chart? That just blows my mind. I know that's getting us off track, but it's the difference between using a thermometer to communicate not the weather, but the how hot it is, the temperature, thank you, that's what I'm looking for, versus using words.
Right.
Oh, it's hot outside. Ooh, it's warm outside. Well, yeah, that's nice, but wouldn't you rather know it's 80 degrees outside, it's 70 degrees outside? That precision is such an important component of science, and we can do that with variability. And of course, we can do it with acceleration, we can do it with a lot of other things, but just to say that right now, I think it's important to share that with people. And probably, whenever we talk about the chart, we should share those features, because people who maybe are on the fence about using the chart, or maybe people who are interested in, hey, what does this mean for my life? How would I use it? That's a really important component for people to grasp and to consider.
Yep. And you said acceleration, but you also can say jump. You can say, I mean, you can put it, so you've got
that.
level, trend, and variability, or you can say jump, acceleration, and bounce.
Yes. And we can put a number on every one of those?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm in love with the chart. I have to admit it. Okay, there, I said it.
You know what? That now you can begin the process.
I can begin the process now.
You've admitted it.
I have. That's the first step. All right, let's get back to variability.
Okay.
If you have a lot of variability, then you need to ask yourself, as a researcher, as an experimenter, what's controlling this? What are the reasons why there's variability in the data? Yes, it can be naturally occurring, but there are other reasons why it might happen. For example, what if you have people who are unreliable when they record the data? What's going to happen?
Variability.
Variability. What's going to happen if you have some cyclical event that always happens at a certain period of time? What are you going to have?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say variability.
You are 2 for 2, Doug. Boy,
All
that's
right.
good. What if you have multiple variables controlling the behavior? What are you going to have?
Wait a minute. Let me think about it.
It's a V word.
It's okay. I'm going to just have to go with variability again.
You're 3 for 3. That's right. All of those could be reasons why you're seeing this behavior bouncing around. You think that, okay, you have this intervention for your math facts, and it's this practice procedure that you're putting in there. That's your controlling variable. You're interested to see how that's working. But there's this other variable in there that's controlling that. And that could be anything. It could be one day you do it, and then let's say that you have another person, a graduate student, who comes in and slips the kid an M&M if he does really well. Well, now you have this other variable you didn't know, or whatever. It could be anything.
Be anything.
And all of those are reasons for your variability. So this conversation we're having about variability is hopefully laying the groundwork for why this article that you and I read is really very important, and it's something I think when people read, they'll find it very useful, very practical, and something that if they're collecting data, they can go ahead and use the technique that's shared in this article.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the article. As we said, the article it talks about variability, and what it's looking at is what it says is, here's the overall message, I suppose. When you look at variability, you can, if you're measuring it, there are ways to tell you, is what you did effective?
Mm-hmm.
And what the article talks about is, I think it's a pretty neat idea here. And the article's talking about how you can use acceleration with variability to figure out if your intervention was effective.
It's a very important concept.
Very important concept. So what they did in their article is they actually had a previous experiment to this, and what they did is they took that experimental the experimental results, and they applied this. So they had they had two procedures that they were doing. They had a total task presentation and a backwards chaining intervention. So they had those two interventions for these students who were putting together, what was it, some kind of, it was a vocational task, right?
Yes.
I can't remember exactly the thing that they were doing.
A drain and a gate valve.
Okay, so they had to put those together, and this is the context. They had these students, and I think these students had, I know these students had disabilities, but again, I'm blocking on What did they have? What kind of disabilities did they have?
Severely and profoundly handicapped.
Okay, yeah, that's right. So they had they used the term severely and profoundly handicapped, and you have these people. They're living in this center. They want to help these people. We know that both of these ways are total task presentation and backwards chaining. Those are two interventions to help someone complete a chain of behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And they did this experiment, and what they did is they said, okay, after, they talk about the experimental design, and they talk about the two tasks, and they show how it works. And then what they did is they applied this procedure for figuring out, does variability, how did this affect the variability? I suppose is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, using bounce around deceleration and seeing what if to aid in determining the effectiveness of the intervention.
Yes.
Okay.
Here's how they did it. Now you're going to have to imagine this because I'm going to try to describe it, and it's always, picture is always better than a verbal description, but I'll try to do my best here. Imagine that you've done something and you have your behavior and it's going a particular direction. Let's say it's going up at let's say it's going up at a times 1.5 acceleration. So imagine what that looks like. Or let's just say times 2. Let's make it easy. Most people know what a times 2 looks like. You have times 2, and the behavior is bouncing. So you have this times 2, but sometimes it's going to be above that acceleration line. Sometimes it's going to be below that acceleration line. How high and how low, when you put an envelope around that, that's a measure of total bounce. If you're really interested, from the acceleration line, you can measure the up bounce. So from the acceleration line to the top part of the envelope, that's called your up bounce. From the acceleration line to the down part of your envelope, that's called the down bounce. And of course, when you have your up bounce and your down bounce together, you call that the total bounce. Following this?
I'm following it.
Good. That is our bounce envelope. And when we look at our behavior, obviously we can measure that and we can put a number to that. Now, the procedure that they have, which is really interesting, is they say, okay, what you do is you look at the lowest frequency in that set of data, right?
Exactly.
Then you would look at the highest frequency in that data set.
Yep.
From that, you would measure it, and then that from the lowest to the highest frequency, you're going to come up with a number. And so you have that number, and then you also have your bounce number. So let's say that your bounce is this is your total bounce for that. You have that times 2 line. The behavior is bouncing around it, and let's say that your total bounce is times 4. Let's just throw that out there, times 4. So it's bouncing, and let's say that your lowest frequency to highest frequency, let's say, just for sake, it's a times 8, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Then what you do is you can figure out how much bounce is not accounted for by acceleration. And simply the way you do that is you divide those numbers. And you're going to come up with another number. Right?
Yep.
Yes. And if you do that, the that number is going to tell you how much bounce is not accounted for. I mean, that's simply how you do it.
So in that example, you gave a times 4 for the up and down bounce, so the total bounce.
Right.
Then total bounce including acceleration, you gave it a times 8, so that would be a 0.5 or 50% not accounted for by the acceleration.
Right. The bigger your number that's not accounted for your acceleration, what that tells us is, well, when something is, when your acceleration accounts for a high percentage of it, then what that's telling us is, hey, this thing that you're doing is having an effect on this variability. It's giving us a number there. And of course, in this instance, you can change it to a percentage. And of course, what the Spooners did when they did this procedure, what they found is that they could say, hey, look, when we did this and we did this measure, we can show that one procedure accounted for more bounce than the other procedure. And let me see if I can remember how this worked out. The total task, what was that? That was it. They have total task was, well, I'll just look at the data. 31, 60.
Well, I think I can tell you it's the range of bounce not accounted for by acceleration for total task was between 16 and 68% with a median score of 41%, but for backward chaining it was 28 to 96% with a median score of 76%. So much more of the bounce was not accounted for by acceleration by using the backward chaining, suggesting it as a less effective procedure than the total task.
Right. And that gets at efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what their point was. That if you look at the relationship between acceleration and bounce, then that really, anyone can measure that when they're looking at their data, and they could come up with this number. And again, that's something that I think many people should be doing, because now if you're comparing things, or even if you're, you don't necessarily have to be comparing things. You could just be looking at your own data set when you are working with your student, and you can say, okay, this is the percentage of bounce that's not accounted for by acceleration. And obviously, the higher that number goes, the more disappointed you'd be, because it means that, A, you're not being efficient with whatever that thing is that you're doing. And of course, the more bounce we have in our data, then we're also basically saying, hey, look, we don't really have a lot of control over what's going on here.
And I guess maybe just restating it, they say it here, but that's accounted for by learning. So the individual, if they have very low bounce around the acceleration, but large bounce including the acceleration, then my learning is accounting for the variability.
Yes, exactly. And that, again, can be done with our standard acceleration chart. You're not using a standard acceleration chart. Everything that we just said, take it off the table.
Yep.
Because you can't do it. And just imagine if we had more people doing this, how much more effective would we be in communicating the results of what we're doing? And how much more would that tell us as whether you're a teacher, a behavior analyst, a scientist, whatever you're doing and you're using this to figure something out, that's just going to help you that much more.
And I'm probably restating the obvious, but if you're not using the chart, then you're back to using words to explain your variability. And
That's
you're
right.
back to saying it's highly variable or not very variable.
Yeah, but this, what we just talked about in this article, you can't do that.
No.
You can do it it's pretty easy to do this. This article,
Right.
what's so nice about it, it tells you step by step how to do this, and it's really easy to do, and anyone could do it, really, with this nice article. And I guess we should point out that this analysis, of course, came from Pennypacker, and Pennypacker, who is the Pennypacker? Lindsley, Koenig and Lindsley, is that the 72 book? I think those are the authors on it. And of course, that book right there, now it's been updated, and of course people can buy that book now. But that book is the handbook that everyone who's serious about charting should own.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Doug, do you have any other comments about talking about measure, quantifying variability, or the things that we can do with it?
No, I really don't have anything else to add right now, but I'm excited to go throw some graphs down and try this out and see if my initial take on it was the same as after doing this. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, spoken like a true, curious scientist. See what happens. Get some data and see what happens. Well, that brings us to our next section, which is an interview with Richard McManus. And let's go ahead and listen to our interview. Well, I would like to welcome Richard McManus to my podcast. For those of you who don't know Richard, Richard is you would be the executive, the CEO, the president of the Fluency Factory.
Exactly.
Yes.
All that.
Richard is a veteran precision teacher who it's an absolute pleasure to have him on today because I've known Richard, how long have I known you? Since the mid-90s maybe? Somewhere around then. And
Had to be. I think it might have been earlier, but let's say the mid-90s.
Okay, yeah, it probably was, but certainly of all the people that, and there's so many in our group, but Richard's definitely one of the ones in my top 10 list that just really knows charting, precision teaching, and really has some unique perspectives on how we deliver education. So, Richard, I'd like to welcome you today.
Thank you so much, Rick. Nice to be here.
Can I ask, I like to always ask this at the very beginning to all of the people on my podcast, and that is, how did you get into precision teaching?
Well, I think I did it in two stages. The biggest step probably was I went to a presentation that Carl Binder did for the psychology department that I worked in at the time at Fernald State School, and also people who were at the Shriver Center. And Carl showed a 6-cycle chart and identified it as this, at that time, standard behavior chart. And everybody else in my department, who were mostly very, very ABA kind of oriented folks, practically threw stones at him. And I thought, wow, where can I get some of those? Because I had serious violent behavior problem folks that I was working with whose behavior bounced all over the place on stretch to fill charts, and I kept throwing them away and starting over. So I said, get me them. How do I get those? I haven't met anybody else that's ever had that reaction. So it's one in a million. And then some years later, probably 5 years later, I was in a room presenting data, and Eric Houghton just basically blew my head off with complaints about the way I was treating children. And I began to understand that we could be doing a lot more than we were doing. I was looking at problem behavior, and he danced on my head enough so I understood why am I doing that? And that changed my life. And I started using the chart for teaching more than for looking at reducing problems. So that's it. Those are my big moments in precision teaching.
And what time was that, in the 70s? That was happening?
Yes, I started using the chart in 1973, and Eric danced on my head in 1978 in March.
Yeah.
I could probably give you the date if I had those old data sharing newsletters that Carl has now put on the web.
So would that make Carl or Eric your chart parent?
Oh, definitely Carl.
Yeah. But certainly Eric had a big influence on you.
He's my godfather.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we should have chart godfathers. I like that concept. Okay, so you learned about this chart, and where were you using this? Was that in the days when you said you were at the state school? And
yes.
As I understand it, you also, at some point, were at Amigo?
True. I started off working at a state institution, and I somehow worked my way up to the psychology department. And throughout it, I was much more client-focused than most of my peers. And just short of being there for 5 years, I thought, I can't be here 5 years. You get a little pin in it. Basically, I don't want that pin. So I decided to leave, went off, rode my bike for a while, and got offered this position at Amigo, which was a school for autistic children that was in total disarray at the time. And I recruited people. I was fortunate when I worked at Fern that I had relationships with people like Paul Touchette and Sidman's group, and just some wonderful young behavioral folks. And once I got that job, I pulled as many of them as I could, and we decided we would do something totally different with teaching autistic kids. And at that time, autism wasn't very well known. Mm-hmm. I would mention that I worked with autistic kids at parties, and people would say, well, that's so nice that they're artistic. You had to really explain to them that that's not what we're talking about. Of course, these days, that's not the case.
No.
But anyway, I went to Amigo, and we were really trying to come up with a whole different way of teaching. We used our backward chaining, kind of discrete trials technology, and we kept noting that, gee, when we think we're doing a good job, but if a kid doesn't practice for a couple of weeks, it's as though we never taught them anything. So that's what made me quite ready for Eric when he danced on my head a couple of years later. I really was feeling like we weren't making the progress we needed to make educationally. And we had wonderful teachers and a really good approach, backward chaining and very careful data collection and really well thought out programs, but we didn't have a way to understand how to make sure the kids had really mastered what we were teaching. Mm-hmm. So a few days after Eric did that, we hadn't thrown them out, but we really revamped almost everything we did over the next several weeks and went to a different way of looking at teaching. Kind of that approach where we would build the component skills first, a fluency-based approach, now people are calling it, but we were using that language as well because Eric had really profoundly impacted the way we thought about teaching.
So when I think back on some of the things that you accomplished, really that work, I suppose, laid the groundwork to what so many people do now. And especially, really, I suppose you all were the forerunners in working with children with autism, especially applying precision teaching. So most of the work you did would involve a composite analysis or element compound types of analyses?
Yes. And I do think at that time we were the first ones doing it, and the students we were working with were quite dangerous young people. They had wound up in this program because there were really only two places that they could be sent at that time. It was either to Amigo or to what was then called Behavior Research Institute. That was also using the chart, but not really as teaching oriented.
Mm-hmm. When I think about you particularly, I think about one of probably a very significant contribution that you made that certainly is enduring today is the notion of the big 6+6 and just how revolutionary that was. Can you talk about that?
I'd love to. We did get it from Eric, though, definitely. I mean, it was one of the things that he imprinted on us. But we immediately understood it in terms of vocational performances. And I guess that's the way I thought about it. And probably for the next 10 or 15 years, I did a ton of work using Big Six principles in vocational rehabilitation. Amigo, let's see, I lasted another almost 2 years at Amigo after that experience. And we were doing things like teaching vocational skills. We had subcontracted materials from a sheltered workshop, and we had tool handling. We were teaching our students to use hammers and saws and silk screens and what other tools, wrenches, and just real tools. They were teenagers, so we thought, we're not going to teach them junk. We're going to teach them how to use real tools. So one of our major students was a kid who'd been raised almost like an animal in Puerto Rico. And when we got him, he was handcuffed and manacled in at Boston City Hospital. And we went to see him, and we thought, he looks like our kind of guy. He immediately bit me and Kevin, who'd come with me. And we said, yeah, we think we can work with this guy. Let's take him home. So we started him in a residential program, and he loved it, and he just flourished and did so well. When we were visited by the referring agency, which was Boston Public Schools, one of their assistant superintendents came to see what happened to him. He kept saying, well, it's an interesting program, but I want to see the kid we sent. So we were in a great big kind of a gymnasium that we had, and I pointed over to the corner and I said, that's him. And he was up on a 12-foot ladder with an apron full of nails, hammering 2x4s together. And I said, that's the guy you sent. He has no more violent behavior, but, so now we're teaching him skills. And our work with those students using the Big Six really changed the amount of endurance they had on any kind of vocational endeavor. They could now work, thanks to building up those component skills, they could now work for 20, 30 minutes without stopping. And when we'd first begun, anything more than 15 or 20 seconds without some sort of interfering behavior or some kind of totally losing the task and wandering off or whacking a teacher or whatever was really a problem. But as those component skills became stronger, we saw the kind of performances that our students would need to be successful in other less intensive programs. And that's kind of how my next chunks of my career went. I started doing, with a partner, Kevin Solston, we started a company called Tools for Change that did behavioral training and consulting. We thought everybody would want to, the results had just come out from Sacagawea School, and we thought people all over the country are going to want to know how to do this stuff, so we're going to be out there teaching them. Mm-hmm. And we were wrong. People from all over the country continued to be indifferent, but there was a huge interest in us going in and solving problem behaviors. So we didn't lack for work, and in fact, the company's still going somewhere. My ex-wife has it, and they're still doing the same kind of behavior solutions work, but that just depressed us after a little while. We really wanted people to move beyond that and teach things. So one of my clients, while I did that, was Work Incorporated, a big rehabilitation facility, and they had come over and seen our autistic children at Amigo, and they had hired me to help them build productivity in a whole range of people. They had about 800 clients of all levels. Some people with just psychiatric disabilities, people with movement problems, blind and blind deaf, retarded folks, autistic folks, every kind of people. So I started doing consulting with them on increasing productivity, with all different kinds of folks. And that was a lot more fun. And the vocational rehabilitation world is much more into measurement than the educational world, because people are paid often on a piece rate basis. So their number per hour is critical, and they have norms that establish pay rates. So if you can teach somebody to work at 200% of the norm, they can get paid, 2 times at least minimum wage. And many of our folks could be paid 2 times prevailing wage, which could be a lot of money in those days around Boston. So that became the next chunk of what I did, using the Big Six and using precision teaching, was productivity increases in a vocational environment. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was really an interesting world. And as I say, because it was very measurement focused, it was a much easier translation. In fact, in the vocational rehabilitation world, there's kind of the looking glass approach to precision teaching. There's something called movement time method that was developed at MIT. And in that method, you look at movements in terms of their fraction of a minute. So like a grasp and release would be a 200th of a minute or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's expressed as a decimal, and then you add decimals up to come up with how much time it would take to do a particular job. Well, it's a hell of a lot easier to do charting than to do that. So, but maybe smartly, the people that do MTM charge even more per hour than we do. So,
so is that like a latency measure?
No, they have, and actually the Department of Transportation as well have, MTM uses fractions or decimal points of a minute, and it's not latency, it's how long it would take to complete a cycle. So that's why it's very much like PT. The DOT has measures of productivity, and they have all classifications of a lot of different job types. So, for example, if you were doing vacuuming, they have how many floor square feet per hour. They do their measurements in hours, not minutes. Mm. So, but again, almost all the vocational world and job costing world uses some form of looking at human movement against a time measure. So, although people still will get that same stunned look when you show them a chart, it's not as ugly as it can be in education.
Yes.
Where there's not that same sense of how many per minute or how many per hour that there is in the rehab. And any kind of work, anybody who does job costing will have a way of looking at productivity in units per hour or square feet per hour or something like that.
What's interesting about that thought is thinking about the concept of productivity and applying it to education, which I don't know how many people actually look at this, but oftentimes, and I've heard Og talk about this before, and actually some of my studies I've been trying to include productivity measures. So if you think about fluency with kids, teaching them something, if they have that skill and it could function at this rate in time, then you start looking a productivity measure. It's going to take the kid this long to read instead of it taking this long. The kid can do his homework in this period of time instead of this period of time. If we could publicize that and actually analyze it more, I think that's something that would really grab people's attention.
I think that's true. That's what we do sell that to our kids here. They'll be like, but why am I doing this? Although not for long, because we have something we call widgets, which are kind of like tokens.
Yes.
And kids love them. and they can buy a range of items. So they don't usually spend a whole lot of time doing philosophical disagreements with us about why am I doing this?
Yeah, I meant the greater educational community at large.
Exactly.
The kids and parents get it.
Well, that's true. I think the kids do get it, and we'll tell them, and it's always been true that, if you do this, you're going to become more able to get out and do other stuff. You won't need to spend as much time on homework. You can get a lot more done. You can create a lot more. You can, listen to American Idol or whatever you want to do. Go on Skype, like my daughter. But there's a lot of different things. To get into the bigger world, I think, you and I said to my staff today, you and I went out to lunch or dinner or something a long time ago when I was doing a lot of consulting work for CLG, I think. And I said, any minute now, Rick, we're going to get our 15 minutes as a community, and we have to be ready. Mm-hmm. That was, I don't know. I was thinking it was 15 years ago, but fortunately, maybe it was only 10. So I'm only off by 10 so far.
You know what, though? I always think about you, too, whenever I see you, because it seems like we are increasing, and it's just
getting younger. And getting younger,
yes.
too. We have young, attractive people in our group, which
Absolutely.
I love.
But
Not just because I'm a dirty old man, but because it's good to have young, attractive people in our group.
Yes, it is. But I think by all measures, you look at people who are attending conferences at ABA, who are coming to the PT conference, who are going to schools like Chuck Merbitz's school, people who are starting to come here to Penn State who specifically want to study precision teaching, seeing teachers out there. We haven't reached anywhere near, I don't even know that we're approaching a critical mass, but that we can be in the ball game and say, hey, look, one of these days we will. I think that's going to happen.
I think it's going to happen by magic more than by critical mass. In other words, I don't think we need to be big. I look at some of the results I've gotten, even this year, some remarkable results that surprised me. And I think sooner or later, somebody is going to go, I'm going to do that with the right kid whose parent is the right parent. And they're going to get that word out there. We have one little girl now was so violent and disruptive when we first met her. And of course, she's classified as ADD or ADHD. She'd never done any work, and her mom brought her in, and it was a lot of money for them. And she said, well, when will I see results? And this little girl, when we first got her in here, was dancing on our tables, running. My poor teachers were just being abused left and right, and she wasn't doing any actual work. And I thought, I better work with this girl because she's trouble. And so her mom asked that, and I'm like, well, a couple of weeks maybe we'll see something, thinking if I can get her off the tables. And I wound up having to do very, very disciplined and careful ignoring of stuff. And at one point, she's a sixth grader, but she's tiny, and she was sitting on top of my shoulders, pulling my ears. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not good. If she pulls my ears off or my nose off, I'll be really sad about that. Meanwhile, we got her reading and doing other work, and it turned out her reading was at about 50 words a minute. This girl plays on a boys hockey team. She at one point here, one of my teachers, she was playing around with a playground ball, and my teacher said, so try standing on that ball. Let's see how long you can do it. She stood on a ball for 24 seconds, balanced.
Wow.
I was amazed. Now she's reading at grade level. She could decode slowly at grade level at about 40 or 50 words a minute. Now she's dependably reading first time at grade level around 130, 140. And she's an amazingly quick learner. And I still keep thinking she needs to come here full time for like the summer to really get her to grade level. But her mom reports she's getting all A's and B's. She's doing homework for the first time ever. She's not fighting with her mom all the time. And when I'll tell her to do something she doesn't want to do, and she'll give me she's a beautiful girl. She'll give me this look right in the eye and say, I hate you. And then whatever it is, she'll just do it. Just say, thank you very much. Please begin. And she will. And, it's an amazing transformation in a very short amount of time, considering the level of total out of controlness that this girl had. And we see her 2 hours a week. I mean, it's not like, I mean, to me, I look at it and think, this is one of the most amazing things I've ever done. I never would have expected she'd have done so well. And it's just the tools that we have, and, Michael's reading program, and, my own long history of people with really serious behavior problems that I can think about. Well, what's really, she loves to be chased and scolded and grabbed, and I'm not doing any of that until she's doing good. I mean, I slap her 5, still pat her on the back. I mean, you need to do physical interactions. I slap the widgets into her hand, whatever, and, she's very clingy, but she's amazingly successful now. So it's just an interesting thing.
That's a wonderful story, and I think it sort of segues into something I wanted to ask you that we've been talking about. You have the Fluency Factory, and so how long has that been? Now, tell me about it. How long has it been open? Who you're primarily working with, and just give us some details about the Fluency Factory.
Well, we have two things now. We have Beale Street Academy, which we're doing in the daytime, and it grew out of Fluency Factory. But I'll tell you about Fluency Factory first. It's been open now 6.5 years. We serve an extremely diverse bunch of kids. We serve pretty much every kind of kid, and we have served a couple of adults. Right now, we are serving kids who go to exclusive prep schools who are just trying to tone up their SATs so they can hopefully get big scholarships in college. We have little kids, like I have my next student coming in is a very shy kindergarten student who was going to be the normal peer in a all-day kindergarten here in town that has what's called inclusive kindergarten. It has some special needs kids and tuitioned in some, or I guess specially chosen, some normal peers, so-called. And this poor little girl fell out of the normal peer group, and they decided to put her in the special needs group. And I said, when I assessed her to her mom, I said, she's a perfectionist. That's all it is. She just doesn't want them to know what she can do and what she can't do. She doesn't really need to come, but, we'd be thrilled to have her, and I think we can get her confidence up, and then she'll just show them what she can do, and it'll all be fine. And sure enough, that's what's happened. And pretty much everything in between. We work with some couple of autistic teenagers right now working on thinking skills and composition skills. We work with some Prader-Willi children. We do no shortage of kids labeled all kinds of labels, but lots of kids who have no labels and are just want to improve skills for other reasons. And the kids love to come, which I think is the other thing that we set out when we started. We wanted to make it a place where kids would like to come. And we're open Saturdays, and over this past vacation we were open. And the kids come in and they're just thrilled to be here, which is amazing to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, we wanted to have that, and we set out to have that, but, until it happens, you're wondering. So.
Sure. You said a number of things that really, well, before I go on to that, tell me about, it's the Beale Street Academy?
Yes. One of our students in particular started with us, about 6 months after we opened. And he had never learned to read or write. He was 10 years old. He's a Prader-Willi identified kid. And really had no academic skills and nobody had ever worked on them. So we started teaching him to read, and we taught him how to write and how to do math. And over the course of time, we used Michael Maloney's reading program with him, and his mom kept saying, he's got to go to a school. He's going to a school for autistic kids because of his behavior problems. And we kept going, what behavior problems? One time he threw his widgets on the floor. I picked them all up and said, we don't throw those here, so I'm keeping them all. And that's the only behavior problem he's had in the 6 years I've known him. So since then, and finally we opened a school. Now he's been in our school. He's the first student. And at this point, he's read all of the Harry Potter books.
Wow.
He's We've read all of the series of unfortunate events as a kind of an in-class thing. Now we're doing kind of typical high school reading materials. We've done To Kill a Mockingbird. He's read all of that. So it's really been an amazing journey for this guy. And he's now doing algebra. He's doing complex math operations. And today he was saying, he said, I don't know if we've done enough to pass that MCAS, which he has not. And he said, I don't think we're going fast enough. And I said, well, it's probably true, but you got to think you've only had 3 years of academic education plus your time at Fluency Factory. The kids that are taking it with you at the same time have had 10, so it's going to be difficult. But he's very concerned. We've been doing a lot more testing to prepare them for the state sponsored No Child Left Behind tests. And, he's very thoughtful about all of this. But that's what got us started. We're still in the throes of getting approved by the state. And that's a nightmare that I think we finally are coming out of the end of that, but I'm not sure yet. But it's been a difficult challenge. I'm much better at teaching and setting up teaching environments than I am at working with bureaucracy. So that's been a tough challenge, and that's many hours of conversation that we don't want to do.
I'm curious, what do you use for math? You use Maloney for Maloney's program for reading.
We use a variety. We're using Sopris West for algebra. We've got a book called Elementary Algebra that I kind of like. For other math, we've used pieces of Elizabeth Houghton's materials. We've used a lot of different things. I'm still not totally thrilled. I'm ready to go to a DI program on some of the steps because I'm feeling like we're still not where I want to be with our students. Now, we haven't needed them with our Fluency Factory students. It's been amazing. I mean, using a lot of Sopris West stuff and just building up fluency on component skills and division and fractions and stuff, we've been able to make really good progress. But you definitely know the difference with students who are missing big chunks of components. It's immediately obvious that, oops, this isn't the right thing after all. We can see it on the chart. We can see it on, finding ourselves still doing a lot of dealing with errors and stuff like that. It's pretty clear we didn't do the right thing.
One of the things I started to say earlier, reflecting back on what you said, and it really is great to hear it, and that is your work is very significant in terms of impacting students, and that's a big part of precision teaching. But the other part of precision teaching is that we have all this work, and only now that we've known that it can do these things, but now that people are actually starting to research it, they are confirming what people have done since the 70s. So I think that's just really neat to see that that's where our field is starting to get at.
Yeah, I agree. And I keep seeing, I know that when we were doing discrete trials in the early and middle 70s, one of the things that struck me even then was, oh my God, we're getting in 3 movements that we want, and my student is getting in 100 that I don't want very much because he's so quick with his hands. He can put in 1,000,000 hand flaps by the time we do our next hammer with a hammer. And when we changed over to looking at components, all of a sudden we had a favorable ratio. We were doing many thousands of practice elements versus a relatively lower number of junk, what we call junk behavior. It wasn't really. I think Eric encouraged me to think about that as developmentally useful behavior that was just kind of like a weed. It was in the wrong place. But if we could get that hand flap to be part of guitar playing, you can make millions. So you have to think about these movements as always useful, but sometimes planted in the wrong place.
That's an excellent analogy. Well, I'm hearing some voice back there, so I know you're in the Fluency Factory.
Yeah.
Well, so we're coming to the end of our interview. Is there anything that I should have asked you or anything that you would like to say that I may have missed?
Not that I've just been very reactive, so I haven't thought about that. If there were any holes, I didn't see them either.
Okay.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I can always talk more, which
Well-
my daughters will tell you is not always a good thing.
Our podcast is been going fairly well recently, and I
Erica?
certainly would like to have you back in the future.
Okay, and maybe you can hear Erica's voice. I'm going to have her come down and say a quick goodbye for me. Hey, Erica! Where's Erica? Hey, Erica! Would you like to put your voice on the internet for a quick moment and just say goodbye to somebody? Oh, well,
Yeah.
she's shy.
Yeah.
Okay, not this time. Maybe
Okay.
another time, Rick.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and it was a pleasure speaking with you.
Great speaking with you. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. Welcome back from the interview. Well, that was a very nice interview with Richard McManus. And in the future, Doug's going to try to join me on some of my interviews. Because of technical difficulties right now, we haven't been able to arrange Doug to get on there. But, of course, we're going to try that this coming month with our next interviewee, which I can say and tell everyone that that's going to be Chuck Merbitz, Dr. Charles Merbitz, we call him Chuck, and he'll be our next interview, and hopefully we'll have, the three of us will be talking about some more precision teaching and acceleration and all the other cool things that we talk about.
Well, I'd like to put a shout out to everybody that go ahead, and I know you mentioned it early in the podcast, but I'd like to see some emails and some suggestions or articles that you'd like us to talk about. That would be really neat to have you drive this podcast rather than Rick and I.
Yeah, because we don't know what we're doing.
Well, we don't know what we're doing, and that's the problem. We're really just this is all new. So
Yeah. All right. Well, Doug, this was a very nice podcast. I always have fun talking with you.
Mm-hmm.
And to everyone else, I would like to say goodbye and tell you all to download our podcast, share it with your friends, and look for our podcast next month. So take care, and thank you for listening to our podcast.
Have a great one.